firstly, thank you so much for joining us for another session of Links Virtual presented by Chainalysis. My name is Jonathan Levin. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer and co-founder of Chainalysis. But I would like to really introduce you to my esteemed guest, Mike Morell, who's joining me today. For those that are unfamiliar with Mike, he is the former acting director and former deputy director of the CIA, one of the leading national security professionals who's been at the forefront of intelligence and foreign policy for a number of years in the fight against terrorism and the work against counter-proliferation. So Mike's still very involved in a wide range of activities as a senior counsel and global chairman of the Geopolitical Risk Practice at Washington's fastest growing consulting firm, Beacon Global Strategies, and is an advisor to a large number of private sector entities. So for those, thanks so much for joining, Mike. It's great to have you here. I just want to introduce people to also Chainalysis in case people have not heard of us. We are the blockchain analysis company. We provide data, software, and services and research to government agencies, financial institutions, and cryptocurrency businesses in over 60 countries around the world. Our data platform powers the investigation workflows, compliance, and risk management for some of the world's most high-profile cases and investigations. And we currently serve a data platform that allows everyone who needs to have information about cryptocurrencies to have that in an easily accessible manner. So we're really excited to have everyone here. We're going to have a brief question and answer session at the end of this. So after a fireside chat, we're going to be taking questions. So if you want to submit those in the Q&A on the Zoom, we'll be taking those. Thanks everyone for joining, and thanks, Mike. It's great to see you on video.
Great to be with you. Maybe I could just, Jonathan, you mentioned that I was acting director, and it reminded me of a story that I think will give people a sense of who's talking to them here. So when I was acting director, my wife and I went out to dinner in Washington, to a restaurant in Washington. And when you're the deputy director, you have a security detail, and you have one armored vehicle, right? When you're acting director or director, you have two armored vehicles that are with you at all times. And so we pull into the parking lot of this restaurant in these two huge armored vehicles, and there's a guy standing against the wall of the restaurant, and he's looking at us, and you can tell by the look on his face, he's trying to figure out, who is this? Is this Michelle Obama? Is this Secretary Kerry? Who is this? And he's on my wife's side of the car. So when she gets out, he says to her, "Is that somebody important?" And without missing a beat, my lovely wife said, "No, he's just acting important."
I think that the best form of defense in those situations is just pure wit. It's just a disarming comment. So I find I've never now in the current form I don't worry too much about these things. But when you do have that front seat at global events that impact the world, it's an amazing time where all of us now get to watch it on social media and television and stuff like that. And I remember I remember exactly where I was on 9/11. I was coming home in London, and all of us rushed together and watched the tragic events in the living room. But you had a different seat on that, and with just like another anecdote to just sort of start this discussion about national security and the current state of how cryptocurrency fits into that. I think it's important to the most important event is, the first, kind of thing that kicked off the counterterrorism agenda. Where were you on 9/11, and what was happening?
So in December of 2000, I was chosen by the then director of CIA, George Tenet, to be President Bush's first daily intelligence briefer. And I briefed him every day, every morning, 6 days a week, no matter where he was in the world, whether he was in the Oval Office, whether he was at Camp David, whether he was at his ranch in Texas, whether he was traveling domestically or internationally. I was with him every morning. So when Air Force One went wheels up on September 10th for a quick trip to Florida for a political event, actually, about the president's education policy, I was with him. And so I was with him all day on September 11th, from when I saw him at 8 o'clock in the morning to brief him until we landed back at Andrews Air Force Base at, I don't know, about 7 o'clock, 7:30 that night. Jonathan, I remember every single detail of what happened that day, but if I were gonna kind of summarize it, I'd say it was a mixture of the intensity of doing my job with the surreal. So I'll give you an example of each. So an example of the intensity of doing my job, after we left Sarasota, we were just flying around the Gulf of Mexico. The president's senior aides were trying to figure out what he should do. President asked to see me in his office on Force One, which is a pretty small place, card. And the president looked me in the eye and he said, "Michael, who did this?" And it's the kind of direct question you get from a president, particularly that president. And I said, "Mr. President, I haven't seen any intelligence that would take us to a perpetrator, so you're going to get my best assessment." And he did another George Bush. He said, "I understand the caveat, now move on." So I said, "Mr. President, your mind might go to nation states, and there's a couple of nation states that certainly have the capability to do this, who provide support to terrorism, Iran and Iraq. But I don't believe that either country has anything to gain, and both of them have everything to lose from doing something like this. So I don't think it was a nation state, Mr. President. I think when we get to the end of the road here, we're going to find Al-Qaeda and we're going to find bin Laden." And I told him that I was so confident in that judgment that I would bet my children's future on it. I've never told my kids that. Then he looked me in the eye again and he said, "When will we know?" Which is, again, kind of a, kind of question you get as a CIA analyst from a president. And it's not a question you can answer, right? So I fell back on something that analysts do, which is provide context. So I told him about previous attacks on the United States and how long it took us to know. So East Africa bombings, a couple of days to know it was Al-Qaeda. The attack on the USS Cole off the coast of Yemen took us a number of months to figure out that it was Al-Qaeda. And then the attack on the Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia, it took us a full year to figure out that the Iranians were behind that. So I said, "Mr. President, with that as background, we might know soon. And then again, it may take some time." So that's an example of kind of the intensity of doing my job. I had a number of those kind of interactions with him during that day. An example of the surreal, as we were landing back at Andrews Air Force Base that night, the president's military aide, the officer who carries the nuclear football, he and I had become friends over the previous 9 months, and he was looking out the windows on the left side of the aircraft, and he saw me looking at him, and he waved me to come over. And the lights were dim inside the cabin for landing. Some people were kind of nodding off. but he saw me looking at him and he waved me to come over. So I did. And I got to the windows and he said, look. And I looked out and there was an F-16 on the wingtip of Air Force One. And he said to me, it's an F-16. It's from the DC Air National Guard. There's another one on the other wingtip. And Jonathan, it was so close that you could see the pilot. You could see the pilot's facial features and you could see the pilot looking at us. And in the distance, you could see the still burning Pentagon. Then he said something to me that to this very day sends shivers up my spine. He said, do you know why they're there? Because at this point, every commercial flight in the United States, right, had been grounded, right? Only planes in the air were military planes. And I said, no. And he said, their job is if someone fires a surface-to-air missile at us on final approach, their job is to put themselves between that missile and the President of the United States. So it's surreal.
Yeah, I mean, the environment, I mean, the fact that these people know, I mean, to even know that fact and be sitting in the plane and understanding that, and the people who otherwise did not even know that in the plane, yeah, that is incredibly surreal.
And maybe I'll just take us, real quick, I'll take us full circle. So when we got bin Laden in 2011, I was the deputy director. And President Obama, knowing that I was with President Bush on 9/11, asked me to go to Dallas and brief President Bush on the bin Laden operation. So I took with me the CIA senior analyst on the issue who could talk to him about how we developed the intelligence. And I took with me the military planner for the raid to talk about the military aspects, right? The raid itself. And we spent 2.5 hours with President Bush, and it was like a kid in a candy store. He wanted to know every detail. And he was particularly interested in those things in the intelligence story that happened while he was still president. And he remembered some of them because he remembered Mike Hayden briefing him about them. And at the end of this 2.5 hours, he said, Laura and I were going to go to the movies tonight, but this is better than any movie you could possibly see, so we're staying home. At which point he gets up and he goes over to his desk and he pulls out his commander-in-chief challenge coin. So for people who don't know, military units have these things called challenge coins that are unique to their unit, and they share them with each other. Well, the commander-in-chief has his own challenge coin. So he takes out these challenge coins and he gives them to us. And when he slaps the challenge coin into my hand and I look into his eyes, I can see closure. And I've seen him regularly since 9/11. So it was the first time I ever saw real closure in his eyes.
And like, I mean, working under him, like, obviously transformed your, like, I mean, the world changed clearly on 9/11, yeah, particularly for your trajectory and your career, was effectively defined on that day for, when you think about like what that did for the national security agenda and how we think about our own nation's the priorities, that continues to be sort of a major component. And I wonder, how much you think that is still impacting, or whether there are now different considerations, whether that did happen 20 years ago, have we moved on? Are there other competition? Are there other wars, for lack of a better term, being waged right now in the world?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So after 9/11, should be no surprise to anybody that our resources shifted dramatically to counterterrorism, literally overnight, money and people. Probably the amount of money that we devoted to counterterrorism might have increased 25 times. And some of that was new money, but some of that was shifted from other things. People, there were no new people. And so literally you had to rob Peter to pay Paul. So, we probably increased the number of folks working counterterrorism by 10 times, pulling them off of other things. And, we had to do it, right? We had to do it, obviously, because they were intent on attacking us again. And they ended up, conducting successful attacks in a number of places, including the UK, including in London, as you know. So this was serious business, but there were other things going on in the world. In particular, Russia was becoming a less democratic state under Putin day by day. It looked, when Boris Yeltsin was president, it looked like Russia was heading in the right direction. And for a while under Putin, it looked like he was heading in the right direction. But then, in a pretty abrupt shift, and he becomes more authoritarian to the point of, I would argue, a dictator today. And China was continuing its rise, right? Because of its economic success. Some of that, most of that earned, a little cheating along the way in terms of stealing intellectual property, but most of it's earned, right? And so they were a rising power. And you had these, two what I would call near peer competitors, and now I would call Russia a near peer competitor, and I'd call China a peer competitor. So that, those two things were happening, and we weren't focusing on them. So when Putin invaded Georgia in 2008, the U.S. intelligence community could not tell the president of the United States where the Russian army was. Imagine that, right? And as an example of these resources being taken off of, right, things that are important and put on counterterrorism, which is obviously important too. And so, those two things were happening. Russia was changing, China was changing, and our focus was elsewhere. And not only were they changing, but from a military perspective, they were studying us. And they were studying how we went to war. And they noticed something very interesting. They noticed that when the United States went to war, it didn't have forces in the region where it was going to fight. And it therefore took the United States a period of months to build up those forces, bring them into theater. And they both came to the conclusion that if they develop weapon systems to keep us out, to slow that arrival down, that they could win a war in their region against us. And so this is the development of Chinese hypersonic missiles, right? The last place you'd want to be in a war against China is on a US naval ship in the Pacific Ocean, because you're dead. You're literally dead because of these hypersonic missiles that they developed for that particular reason, to keep us away. So there was a huge number of things going on, right? Those two most important, and certainly the first 10 years after 9/11, but I'd say to this very day, because there are, because of Afghanistan, there's still a huge focus on counterterrorism, and because of Iraq and because of ISIS, and so we're still not able to put the focus that we need to put on these two near peer competitors, particularly China. In the long run, I don't really worry that much about Russia because they don't have an economy. They got huge demographic problems. They have an economy that is over-dependent on oil and gas. So I don't worry, too much about Russia over the long term. But China wants to redefine the world in a way that the world looks like them. They want significant influence in the world, for countries to make economic decisions that are in Chinese economic interests. And they think that countries that are authoritarian like them will be more likely to make decisions that are in their interests. So this is the first time since Mao that China is actually out on the road selling their system of government and their system of managed capitalism. And they have a pretty good argument, actually, when they sit down with the leader of another country, because they they point to themselves and they say, hey, we're doing pretty well here. And they point to America and they say, look at that, right? Look at that mess there. So they have pretty strong arguments. So not only do we need to pay, much more attention to what they're doing from an intelligence perspective, but we have to fix ourselves, as a democracy and as an economy if we're going to be able to compete with them. So, it was a lost, while we needed, obviously, to focus on Al-Qaeda, in a sense, it was a lost 20 years in terms of the long-term challenges, and particularly China, the long-term challenge to the United States and its allies in the world.
And I think that's a great way to frame up sort of where we are at today, and what are the priorities and what are the focus areas. Because if you look at the Belt Road Initiative, you can clearly see that there is a plan, that there are priorities, and there's a lot of deliberate action on how China is projecting that power. And one of the ways in which this is occurring, and it's occurring across the board, is on the global financial system. And when you think back and you think about what are the major things that have changed, I mean, in a lot of ways, those years were defined by the dominance of the US dollar, the strength of the US economy, and the ability for the US to really provide the financial infrastructure for the world. And when you look at the world today and you see what China has in terms of its fintech companies that are larger than any fintech company that's built in America, you look at the amount of foreign investment and you look at how this is unfolding, you can see that there is massive competition for the future of value transfer. And one of the core pieces of technology that is powering this, and the Chinese have shown interest in it, and there's other nations that are obviously showing interest in it with allies as well. You can see that there is actually a need for nations to understand how is this new system of value transfer going to impact the way that the world transacts. And one of the things that I find most interesting is that when did you first come into contact with cryptocurrency? And what did you think?
Yeah. So and I'll tie these together. I'll try to tie them together. So I left CIA in August of 2013. I retired. And I spent most of my time, a little bit of time doing venture capital and private equity, but I spent most of my time talking to companies about what's going on in the world and what it means for their business. And cryptocurrency never came up as an issue when I was the deputy director. It wasn't on my radar. Nobody ever gave me a briefing on it. I never read a paper on it. It wasn't an issue we ever discussed in policy circles. So it just wasn't there. And when I got out of government, I went for a number of years, 6 years, kind of reading about it in the popular media, reading about it occasionally in magazines, but never really paid a lot of attention to it, and didn't know a lot about it until somebody that you and I both know very well asked me to take a look at illicit finance and Bitcoin. And what this person asked me to do was, there's a narrative out there, right, that Bitcoin is primarily used for illicit finance. And he said, look, I want to know if that's true. I don't think it's true, but if it is, I want to know. It'll affect, my day-to-day actions. And I want somebody who isn't in the industry to do this for me. And I want somebody who, was kind of trained to do analysis. and do analysis objectively. So one of the things that CIA analysts really try hard to do is not let politics or even a policy view affect how you think about an issue, right? It's a core tenet of being an analyst at CIA. So he said, I want you to apply those skills, and I want you to apply that objectivity. And I want you to look into this. I know you don't know much about it, and I want you to come back and tell me what you think. So that was about maybe a year ago, a little less than a year ago, that he asked me to do this. And as you know, all this resulted in a paper that I wrote and got some publicity. And so what I did is I did exactly what I would have done as an analyst at CIA. I had my assistant put together a thick read book with all sorts of documents, government documents, non-government documents, anything that he thought was interesting and he thought that I needed to know. And he highlighted it, make it easy for me. But the thing was about that thick at the end of the day. It was about 6 inches, 7 inches thick. So I spent a weekend going through that. And just like when I was an analyst, I started jotting down themes. I started jotting down themes that I saw. And I also jotted down additional questions that I had. So that was the first thing I did. The second thing I did was I asked my folks at Beacon to put together a list of people who they thought I should talk to. And there were, I don't know, 20 people on the list. You were one of them, as you remember. And I interviewed those folks and to try to better understand. And so I asked a lot of the questions that were on my list. I learned a tremendous amount through those conversations. I went back to people multiple times, including you. And themes emerged. And the two dominant themes emerged as I did this. One was that, sure, bad people use crypto for bad things, without a doubt. It's why your firm exists, right? But in terms of the scale, it's nowhere near what the popular myth is, right? That was one. It was one finding. The other finding was the power of the blockchain, which you know this better than anybody, right? The power of the blockchain to actually find these people and bring them to justice. And so those are the two things that I talked at length about in the paper, as you know. But there was a third thing, there was a third theme that I kept on running into. And I wasn't asked to look into this by our mutual friend. And so I didn't write about it, but it was a theme I kept on seeing. I think I even told you about it at one point, which is the illicit finance stuff was the question I was asked, but it's not the interesting thing, actually, right? We can actually deal with the illicit finance thing. The really interesting thing to me was that crypto, fintech in general, and crypto as part of that, is a very important aspect of the competition between the United States and China. For all the reasons you said, for all the reasons about, he who controls payments, controls the world. It really matters that the dollar is the reserve currency. That has given us a tremendous amount of influence in financial markets, in financial market policy, how economies are run, how they're managed, and the influence that gave the U.S. government with regard to other countries. Not to mention that, in the middle of the Bush administration, Stuart Levy, who you know, right, discovered this magical foreign policy tool which was secondary sanctions, right? So the US had used sanctions for a very, very long time, and they never worked. Sanctioning a company or an individual directly, company doesn't really work. There's easy ways around it. But secondary sanctions, right? Saying to global financial institutions and global companies that if you do business with the Iranians, our financial companies and our companies can't do business with you. That is really powerful. And Stewart discovered this, and it was applied to the Iranians. And President Obama kept the pressure up when he became president, and it ultimately resulted in the Iranians coming to the negotiating table and negotiating the first nuclear agreement, which we should have never left, but that's a whole other story. So, in general, the dollar as the reserve currency is important. And then in particular, if it wasn't, these secondary sanctions would not be particularly useful either.
Right.
And I think that China's interest in fintech in general, and crypto in general, and a digital yuan in particular, is in part driven by an understanding of what I just said. I will also say their interest in a digital yuan is driven not only by their interest in the financial aspects, there's a political aspect for them. So the Chinese Communist Party's primary goal in life is for the Chinese Communist Party to continue to exist. That is their number one policy objective. And so the thing that they are most afraid of is the emergence of alternative power centers in China. And so when they see large Chinese financial institutions gaining strength, that scares them. And part of wanting a digital yuan is not only about what it means for the competition with the US and for sanctions evasion, but it's also about having an alternative to digital payment systems, by WePay or Alipay or whatever, because they don't want those organizations to get too much political power. So, I was telling everybody when I did this paper, this paper is interesting. I find this paper interesting. It's what it's what my client wanted. But there's this other thing that's actually much more important. And that's this fintech. And I would finish here, Jonathan, by saying that if you talk to most national security people and ask them what technologies that we're in competition with the Chinese are the most critical. And, people would say microelectronics, right? Semiconductors, because they're the basis of everything. Yep. They would say radio access, right? So 5G. Yep. They would say synthetic bio. They would say AI. They would say quantum, and the list would keep going, and they would never say fintech. Well, I think fintech belongs on that list. I really do think fintech belongs on that list. And in conversations that I have now with other national security people and conversations I have back inside my government, I make that very clear. And in some of the interviews I did on the paper that I wrote, we ended up talking more about that than we ended up talking about illicit finance.
Yeah, so, I was going to say I was going to be like Bush, and I was going to be like, how long did it take you to get there? But when will we know? But you arrived at that like fairly quickly. I mean, from the conversation, and you've reframed the entire discussion around what does it mean? How actually does the national security apparatus in the US? What role do they play in ensuring that this actually doesn't become the future? that we don't lose this battle on innovation. And then like, how is that being received, would you say?
Yeah. So it's a good question. So the intelligence community is just starting to focus on it. It's become an issue, but also in part because a mutual friend of ours, David Cohen, who was the illicit finance guy at Treasury, is now the deputy director of CIA, and I think he's brought some focus to it at CIA. So they're paying more attention. There's more conversation about it in national security circles. There's more conversation about it in policy circles. But one of the things that I'm concerned about, and this goes back to the illicit finance, is look, you got to pay attention to that. Regulation is important, but there's a balance here to strike. There's a balance here to strike between the regulation you need for KYC and AML and over-regulating to the point where you stifle the development of the industry and you stifle innovation in the industry, right? And therefore give the Chinese, kind of a free pass. So I don't think that balance that I just talked about is really understood at policy levels inside of our government. And I think that's still a lesson to be learned, and it worries me a little bit.
Yeah, and let's just take a particular example, because we started with 9/11, and Chris Wray recently came out in testifying in front of Congress and said that the FBI is treating ransomware as serious as they needed to treat counterterrorism after 9/11. That we are seeing massive hits to critical infrastructure, that there is vulnerabilities in this country where adversaries are targeting, and it's critical to our national security that we need to elevate the response to ransomware on the level that we responded to 9/11, and for that it brings me back to say the illicit finance angle of ransomware, the entire sort of value chain that exists. It's a business. It's a financial system that actually needs a financial solution to the problem. That you need to understand the entire supply chain and be able to cut off the enablers in that supply chain in order to be able to fight this threat. And there's another point of view, which is that people are talking about regulating cryptocurrency more severely in order to get rid of the problem. And this brings in that tension for me, where what does it take for us to mobilize the agencies that actually have the authorities to go after the adversaries and the enablers in order to protect actually the thoughtful policy that we actually can put in place to grow the industry. And I guess, like, how do we square that circle, and have we ever been able to do it effectively?
Yeah. So ransomware is as a growing problem. It's a very serious problem. The FBI, I think, estimated last year that the amount of ransom that was paid was somewhere between $25 billion and $30 billion to ransom paid. And it's growing at 30% a year. So if you do the math, and they expect it to continue to grow at 30% a year. So if you do the math, right, you're at somewhere between, somewhere around $250, $300 billion by 2030. This is a business, which is why it is growing. The rate of return on this business is pretty attractive. If it was legal, I would invest in it. It would be a good investment. And it's it's growing in the number of attacks. It's growing in the amount of ransom that is being requested. Used to be hundreds of dollars, now it's millions of dollars. It's being directed at critical infrastructure. Why? Because the groups that are in business doing this, and we'll come back to them in a second, the groups that are in business doing this have learned that the owners of critical infrastructure are willing to pay a lot of money, more money than people who run businesses that aren't critical infrastructure. So of course they're going to migrate there. There's also a trend to what I'd call double extortion. So the first extortion is the encryption of your data, and the providing of a key if you pay the ransom, and then they say to you, oh, by the way, we actually stole some of your data, which we're going to publicize unless you make a second payment. So there's double extortion going on. This is a very difficult problem because of where it comes from. I mean, if somebody set up an operation to do this in the United States or the United Kingdom, they'd be out of business in a week, right? The authorities would be at their door very quickly. But the vast, vast majority of this ransomware comes from Russia. And it is Russian organized crime. And you ask, why would Vladimir Putin allow this to occur? And there's two reasons. One is anything to screw with the United States, anything to make our life more difficult. But two, and probably more important, is a lot of these organized crime guys are political supporters of Putin. And so he has a strong political incentive to let them continue to do their thing. And then you have the guys who actually do the hacking. And these turn out to be guys who work for Russian intelligence during the day, doing national security espionage, which pretty much every country does. Yeah. And they work for Russian organized crime at night, during ransomware. So, the chances of Vladimir Putin shutting this down, not great, right? So what does the US do about this? How do they react? And the right answer is twofold, right? Well, the right answer is to do exactly what you said, which is deter them, right? So how do you deter somebody? Well, classic deterrence theory says you deny their objective, right? You make it difficult for them to do what they want to do. So that means cyber defense. And organizations need to take cyber defense very seriously. They need to understand it's not just a one-time fix, because the offense evolves every day, that the defense needs to evolve too. So it's a constant upgrading of your cybersecurity system that's necessary. So cyber defense to deny the objective and then impose a cost. So how do you impose a cost? Well, in his press conference after his meeting with President Putin, Biden said, we might use our own cyber capabilities here in response. And what he meant by that was using cyber offense for cyber defense. In other words, attacking the server that's attacking us, right? So identifying the server where the ransomware attacks are coming from and destroying it. That's what he meant. But you know as well as I do that that one server gets destroyed today, and tomorrow you're on a different server, right? This is, denying, imposing a cost that way is not going to be high enough to get these guys to think twice about it. Taking their money from them is a way to impose costs, right? And we just saw that play out with one of the recent ransomware attacks, where the US government was able to retrieve a significant amount of money that was paid to these organized crime groups. How did they do that, right? My guess, you probably know better than I do, but my guess is they used the blockchain. to identify where the money went, and figured out where it was and seized it. And so that's a great example of, people think crypto's the problem, right? In allowing this ransomware to occur. Believe me, it would occur irregardless of whether cryptocurrency exists. They'd find another way to ask for their money. But quite frankly, the fact that they do it with cryptocurrency and on the blockchain, allows organizations like yours and allows governments to track it down. I think I actually said in a paper when I was talking about the power of the blockchain is that if I could choose a method for bad guys to use that would increase, that would maximize my chances of catching them, it would be crypto.
Right.
For that very reason. So we got to really make sure that we don't make mistakes here, because we're frustrated, right? When you're frustrated and you're trying to find a policy solution and people are banging on you for a policy solution, sometimes you make mistakes. And we got to make sure we don't make mistakes here. By clamping down.
I think that's a really good, clearly there's, there are these successes that are now public about, some of the disruption. And in actual fact, the interesting part about there being this supply chain is that even if the author of the ransomware is in Russia, there are actually affiliates and enablers and server providers that exist in our ally countries.
Right.
And by working much closer with our international partners who really do have a joint incentive to act, we can establish some really strong deterrent and disruption. And there can also be, a breakdown of the communication that's actually being used by all of these different actors. So, Netwalker had an affiliate that was based up in Canada. We assisted on the ability to trace the payments that went to the affiliate that actually, were part of Netwalker infecting lots of different victims. And it's about actually coming up with and realizing that actually a lot of this infrastructure and enablement is happening outside of countries that we can't touch. And that's where there is this opportunity. And there's also the opportunity, to your point about what Biden's saying, is that, there's a whole government approach where you identify who's going after the third-party money launderers, who's responsible for going after, inadequate cyber defenses. How do we divvy up the responsibilities of the entire supply chain? Who are our specialists at doing the different aspects of this, and how do we coordinate a whole government response in the same way, that happened in 9/11? Like there was a coherent strategy in response to the issue.
In fact, you're reminding me, right? You're reminding me, or what you're saying is resonating with me to the point where the problem of ransomware is in some ways similar to the problem of terrorism, in that it's actually difficult to get at the bad guys themselves, right? And so we initially went after those things that enabled them that we could get after. So we went after their money flows through hawalas.
Right.
We went after the flow of recruits, right, who were going from maybe Egypt to Afghanistan or Pakistan, and you stop them and you don't allow that to happen, right? So we went after those things that were enabling the extremist groups when we couldn't get to them directly. And the other thing that resonated with me was no one country could have done that by itself, right? That took countries working together. And that is absolutely what's necessary here too. I guess the one thing that worries me and may take a little bit of time here is when you were faced with the terrorism problem, it's pretty easy for somebody of, kind of above average intelligence to kind of figure these things out. Here, in this case, there is some specialized knowledge that's required. And I worry sometimes that the government doesn't have enough of that, which means one of two things, right? It's gotta bring it in itself, which is not easy in terms of being able to find it, and it takes time. And so the other alternative is to outsource, right? Outsource some of what you're doing. So I think, it really resonates with me what you said.
And I think one of the things about outsourcing is, obviously we contract with governments around the world. We serve as their experts on the issues and understand and have access to the data that allows them to actually get after these problems. But I think what you're saying is also the idea of partner or outsourcing and partnership applies to cryptocurrencies in a very unique way, which is the blockchain is public, which means that the government has the ability to actually share intelligence that is not classified. And it doesn't just exist inside the building about what some of these threats are and what these actors are up to. Actually, the selectors and indicators that need to be shared can be shared in an easy way internationally that can coordinate a targeted approach at the enablers and at the adversaries. And so not only is it the traceability of the blockchain that allows an analyst to sit there and go and find who's coming after you, it actually, the nature of the technology is that you can find a way to collaborate internationally between different people in order to have, an effective real-time response. Right. And I would say the difference between, and terrorism has evolved in the same way, where, a lot of recruitment happens online, a lot of recruitment happens in open source and in these different places. And there's massive coordination on how we fight that. And it's the openness of the communication, and it's the openness of the blockchain that actually allows for effective intelligence sharing to be there. And I would say the other thing that seems to be happening in the cryptocurrency space in particular is that people building companies in this new technology do care about the world. They do care about the future of the industry. People in the industry ask people like you to make a real assessment on, tell me the reality about what's going on. Give me the objective opinion about whether this is being used for illicit activity. And what we are seeing in our world is that the industry are standing by, waiting to collaborate with the government on being able to share these indicators. Let's get to the arrangements where we have policy in place that allows for this type of information sharing. Let's get in place the international architecture that we need to be able to bring together private and public sector, because like even in the example of counterterrorism, there were these collaborations, there are these collaborations that matter the most for effectiveness. And so, I think that's something that for me really is coming to the fore with ransomware. And I think, it's about getting it up the policy agenda and being able to have this coordination between different nation states.
Yeah, I'm kind of hoping, a little bit that Colonial Pipeline might be a wake-up call, inside government, as to thinking through, many of the things we're talking about here.
Yeah, I have this op-ed, or I have a couple of op-eds in my drawer, and I keep thinking about, did I just miss the opportunity? Did I just miss the one attack that I should have dropped it straight after it? And the reality is that, as you said, this is not going away. There are these. It's an ongoing threat. It is growing. But my observation is, with Chris Wray's comments, with other people that we're hearing in the government, this is being taken incredibly seriously. There is a question in here that is about, the question is cryptocurrency a freedom enhancing technology? And if it is, does it make sense for sort of the US and, you know, countries that value freedom and innovation, does it make sense for them to actually push some of its adoption? And you know, does that gain geopolitical advantage to the, you know, I guess for lack of a better term, the free world?
Yeah, I guess it depends on what kind of cryptocurrency we're talking about here, right? You know, I think that private cryptocurrency is freedom enhancing. In fact, I think it's one of the drivers, right, behind it. Lack of trust in governments. But I think digital currencies of governments, not necessarily, right? In addition to the two reasons I gave you for why Beijing is thinking about a digital yuan, right? One was geopolitical with regard to us. Another was political at home with regard to political power. But there's actually a third, which is the information that it would provide to the government about its own citizens. In just the same way, you know, every transaction being public, every transaction they would see, the government would see, the government of China would see. So I think it depends on what kind of cryptocurrency you're talking about here.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and I think that you know, one of the things in that is, you know, we were talking about economists before we jumped on here, and one of the things that we don't estimate well is technology and innovation. And I think that one of the things that talks about freedom and the need to sort of keep reasserting that is the ability for the technology to truly evolve and for people to essentially have this inevitability behind how these things are issued, which is I think part of the power behind cryptocurrencies. Mike, I want to say thank you so much for this dialogue and discussion. I don't think we got to any of the pre-prepared questions, so really appreciate you.
You're welcome.
I really appreciate you coming and having this chat. You know, thanks everyone for tuning in and watching live. We will make a recording available shortly on our website, and we'll be continuing to host additional thought leadership sessions as part of Links Virtual and the Women in Crypto series here at Chainalysis. So thanks so much for tuning in, and we hope to see you at an event soon.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Mike.
Bye.